Hello, and welcome to the America First Committee, episode number 3. We have a great show today. Last week I wasn't able to get to the Benghazi Report, which I have right next to me, and so we're going to dive into that shortly. And also, some pretty big news happened in Egypt, which I would love to bring up because it does relate to us in a pretty significant fashion. But, just to hone back into the purpose of the show, the America First Committee, the purpose is to demonstrate that the theory that America should not be actively involved, as in sending weapons, sending money to despots and dictators, and gallivanting and destroying other countries, is not in our best interest, and that it actually makes us less safe at home. So it was named after the original America First Committee, which was an anti-war group prominent in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, trying to prevent us from entering into World War II. And with that, I would like to jump right into the Benghazi Report. So, about 2 weeks ago now, the Benghazi Report came out. This was authorized by Congress, and it was an investigation into what caused the Benghazi tragedy, any and all relevant facts related to it, and it was officially done because there was a lot of serious questions that needed to be answered. And according to congressional inquiries, we have the executive summary, which I would like to read in its entirety to you. The House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence conducted a comprehensive and exhaustive investigation into the tragic attacks against 2 U.S. facilities in Benghazi, Libya, on September the 11th and 12th, 2002. The nearly 2-year investigation focused on the activities of the intelligence community before, during, and after the attacks. During the course of thousands of hours of detailed investigation, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence reviewed thousands of pages of intelligence assessments, cables, notes, and emails, held 20 committee events and hearings, and conducted detailed interviews with senior intelligence officials and eyewitnesses to the attacks, including 8 security professionals on the ground in Benghazi that night. This report details findings and conclusions of that investigation. In summary, the committee first concludes that the CIA ensured sufficient security for the CIA facilities in Benghazi, and without a requirement to do so, ably and bravely assisted the State Department on the night of the attacks. Their attacks saved lives. Their actions saved lives during those attacks. Appropriate U.S. personnel made reasonable tactical decisions that night, and the committee found no evidence that there was either a stand-down order or a denial of available air support. The committee, however, received evidence that the State Department's security personnel, resources, and equipment were unable to counter the terrorist threat that day and required CIA assistance. The second finding. The committee finds that there was no intelligence failure prior to the attacks. In the months prior, the intelligence community provided intelligence about previous attacks and the increased threat environment in Benghazi. But the IC, which is the intelligence community, did not have specific tactical warning of the September 11th attacks, 2012. Third, the committee finds that a mixed group of individuals, including those affiliated with Al-Qaeda, participated in the attacks on U.S. facilities in Benghazi, although the committee finds that the intelligence was and remains conflicting about identities, affiliations, and motivations of the attackers. Fourth, the committee concludes that after the attacks, the early intelligence assessments and the administration's initial public narrative on the causes and motivations for the attacks were not fully accurate. There was a stream of contradictory and conflicting intelligence that came in after the attacks. The committee found intelligence to support the CIA's initial assessment that the attacks had evolved out of a protest in Benghazi, but it also found contrary intelligence, which ultimately proved to be the correct intelligence. There was no protest. the CIA only changed its initial assessment about a protest on September 24th, when closed caption television footage became available on September the 18th, 2012, 2 days after Ambassador Susan Rice spoke, and after the FBI began publishing its interviews with U.S. officials on the ground on September 22, 2012. Fifth, the committee finds that the process used to generate the talking points that the House On-Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence asked for, and which were used for Ambassador Rice's public appearances, was flawed. The House committee asked for the talking points solely to aid members' ability to communicate publicly using the best available intelligence at that time, and mistakes were made in the process of how those talking points were developed. Finally, the committee found no evidence that any officer was intimidated, wrongfully forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement, or otherwise kept from speaking to Congress or polygraphed because of their presence in Benghazi. The committee also found no evidence that the CIA conducted unauthorized activities in Benghazi, and no evidence that the intelligence community shipped arms to Syria. This report, and the nearly 2 years of intensive investigation it reflects, is meant to serve as a definite House statement on the intelligence community's activities before, during, and after the tragic events that caused the deaths of 4 brave Americans. Despite the highly sensitive nature of these activities, the report has endeavored to make facts and conclusions within this report widely and publicly available so the American public can separate the actual facts from the swirl of rumors and unsupported allegations. Only with a full accounting of the facts can we ensure that tragedies like the one that took the lives of Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty never happen again. That is the general executive summary of the Benghazi Report from Congress. Now, what I found most intriguing was not any elements like they had said. There was some, I don't know if conspiracy theorists would be correct, but some people that were strongly questioning what had gone on there, and that obviously they felt that perhaps it could have been prevented. This put some of those to rest, but what I found most disturbing, in my opinion, is the constant drumbeat for war, and how this was able to identify and pick up the fact that the intelligence that was used to try to tell the public what happened factored that in, that it was supportive of that war beat and that war drum in the Middle East that we keep finding ourselves in. One of their findings, this is within the publication, it's about 37 pages, and in it they have, I think, 13 findings, which is what they distill down into those general summary notes. So I'm going to read you number 4, and it's just some of the highlighted parts that I think are important in regards to not telling the public the truth and having a narrative and then cherry picking to fill that narrative up. After the attacks, the early intelligence assessments and the administration's initial public narrative on the causes and motivations for the attacks were not fully accurate. The House Panel Committee asked for the talking points which Ambassador Rice ended up using for her talk show appearance on September 16, solely to aid the members' ability to communicate publicly using the best available intelligence at that time. The process and edits of these talking points was flawed. Finding number 11. Ambassador Rice's September 16th public statements about the existence of a protest, as well as some of the underlying intelligence reports, proved to be inaccurate. Much of the early intelligence was conflicting, and 2 years later, intelligence gaps remain. That is a fact throughout the 37 pages. That is a fact that keeps popping up. But they had to go to the public with something and say, don't worry, the Middle East, our actions over there are being justified, and we are not causing any more ill will towards us or providing easy targets for our enemies abroad. Various witnesses and senior military officials serving in the Obama administration testified to this committee, the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, that they knew from the moment the attacks began that the attacks were deliberate terrorist attacks against U.S. interests. No witness has reported believing at any point that the attacks were anything but a terrorist act, as compared to what Ambassador Senator Susan Rice said at that time when she went up to, I think it was Meet the Press, where it spawned out of this disturbing film by an American, a naturalized American out west. So I guess her mentality, or the administration's mentality, is blame Americans first for upsetting the world instead of actually realizing that we're being attacked. Let's see. On September 14th, CIA Director Petraeus spoke extensively to the committee about AAS, which is probably an acronym. Let's see. And these are terrorist organizations. Ansar al-Sahariya, participation in the attacks. However, he did not say that they conducted or orchestrated the attacks. In November 2012, he testified to the CIA that he still cannot yet establish responsibility, but there are several data points we are continuing to follow. As for motivation, while Reuters published a series of news articles right after the attacks that included interviews of individuals who claimed they were eyewitnesses to the protest on the compound, there were also early reports that the attacks were not spurred on by a protest in Benghazi. The first CIA assessment about the attacks on September 12th, executive update said the presence of armed assailants from the incident's outset suggests there was an intentional assault and not the escalation of a peaceful protest. We go further into it. The first indication, here's a quote from an individual, the first indication that there may not have been a protest arrived on the 14th of September in the form of an intelligence report from the Tripoli station. On the morning of Saturday, September 15th, which he read as part of his morning reading that day, the email stated that the Tripoli station assesses that the 11-12 September attacks in Benghazi were not spurred on by local protest. That is before she went on Meet the Press, Ambassador Susan Rice. Let's see. Here is the part that I highlighted and put an asterisk next to because, again, this is so vital in the fact that this was not just giving us the facts, it was cherry-picking the facts to support their foreign policy, which has not been helpful. On Saturday, September 14, 2012, Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes wrote in an email titled Prep Call with Susan Rice, Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, that one of the goals of the administration's public statements should be to underscore that these protests are rooted in an internet video and not a broader failure of policy. Whatever the larger policy issues, the conclusion that the protests were fully rooted in a video was incorrect, as we are underlying early intelligence estimates concerning the video. Ben Rhodes, his first quote was to underscore that these protests are rooted in an internet video and not a broader failure of policy, end quote. That is the most condemning sentence I could think of to actually say that they were actively misleading and actively looking for facts that only back up their side of the story, not just giving the American public, here are the straight facts, here's what happened, it was a great tragedy, we're trying to piece it all together. No, it was, we found the person to blame, it's some guy out in California, and what he did was improper and wrong, and they went on that storyline, and they thought that was the way to deflect it from the fact that perhaps their foreign policy of inflaming the region could have contributed to it. So that is the Benghazi Report and some important highlighted areas of it from my perspective and hopefully from the perspective of you, the viewer, and people with the America First mentality. Now, what I really would like to do is to jump into the recent situation in Egypt. And I have some articles here. I'm going to pull them over. Yoink. And I'm going to go pull up the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, online, because this is the article I'll be reading from. We have Hosni Mubarak, Egypt court drops charges over 2011 uprising deaths, from the BBC. A court in Egypt has dropped charges against former President Hosni Mubarak over the killing of 239 protesters during the 2011 uprising against him. The Cairo court erupted in cheers when the judge said Mubarak should not have been a defendant in the case, as the charges against him were added later. Charges against 7 senior ex-officials were also dropped. The decision could be appealed. Victims' relatives waiting outside expressed dismay and frustration, and later police fired tear gas to disperse a crowd of 2,000 people who gathered near Tahir Square to voice their opposition to the decision. In a television interview after the ruling, Mubarak said he had done nothing wrong at all. The former president, 86, is serving a separate 3-year sentence for embezzlement of public funds. At the scene, BBC's Orla Gurian in Cairo. In a rare and risky act of defiance, crowds gathered close to Tahrir Square, the birthplace of the 2011 revolution. It was a relatively small protest, but hugely symbolic. Both liberals and Islamists called for freedom. For some, it felt briefly like an echo of the revolution. The security forces moved in after a few hours, causing mayhem with tear gas. We heard the crackle of live ammunition in the night air. What happens next is a critical test for Egypt. Will the protesters try to regroup in spite of a law banning unauthorized demonstrations? Or will the authorities manage to stamp out the latest eruption of dissent as they have crushed others? Getting back into the story as a whole, he is currently being held, Hosni Mubarak, he is currently being held in a military hospital and expected to serve at least a few more months of his sentence. Mubarak and his former interior minister, Habib al-Adali, and 6 others had been convicted of conspiracy to kill and were sentenced to life in prison in June 2012, but a retrial was ordered last year on a technicality. In all, some 800 people are thought to have been killed as security forces battled protesters in the weeks before Mubarak resigned on February the 11th, 2011. However, the court documents at the retrial related to the deaths of 239 people and the injuries sustained by 1,500 plus across 11 of the country's regions. As well as the murder charge, Mubarak was also cleared of corruption charges involving gas exports to Israel. As supporters cheered the verdict, his sons and co-defendants stooped down to kiss him on the forehead. Later, the former president gave an interview by phone to the private Sada al-Balad television. "I did nothing wrong at all," he said, adding that he was relying on God as he waited for the second verdict of the case. But relatives of those killed in 2011 reacted with anger. "There is no justice for the poor," said Ramda Ahmed, who lost his son Mohammed in Alexandria during the unrest. Quoted by the Associated Press, "This is Mubarak's law." Now we're going to go a little deeper into it, talking about the mixed reactions as Mubarak case dropped. It's another BBC article to try and just to flesh out this so that we can understand my next part of this whole argument. We're diving into the problem that's happening in Egypt. There were mixed reactions to the Egyptian media after a court in Cairo dropped murder charges against former President Hosni Mubarak and 7 of his senior police officials. The channel, privately owned Sada al-Balad TV carried a report on Mubarak's biography, focusing on his achievements during his military career and 30 years in office. Keep in mind that currently in Egypt, there is a autocrat in charge who is from the military, which is where Mubarak was from also. They had a military coup which ousted the quasi-democratically elected government after the revolution that came in. So two other private television shows showed footage of Mubarak supporters celebrating the ruling outside the court. Mubarak supporters on social media also congratulated him. "I am sorry, Mr. President," a Facebook page which has more than 1.6 million likes said. He prayed to God to make him victorious after he was facing injustice. After the ruling, though, various media outlets wondered who was to blame for the protesters' death. If it was not Mubarak and his security chiefs, who actually ordered those killings? They could never get the answer. And with the current president, autocrat, Sisi, in charge, most likely they will not get the answer. Now, how does that relate to us? This relates to us in the United States because we give Egypt a whole bunch of foreign aid for their military. And we keep giving it to them, even though their military overthrew a quasi-democratically elected government. And we keep on funneling that money to them. This is from the U.S. State Department, and it is in response to a question. Question: what is the breakdown of U.S. aid to Egypt? What money has been paid out and what is left? This was asked in April of this year. Let me take a water break. The Egypt bilateral foreign assistance budget for 2012 is approximately 1.5 billion US dollars and includes 1.3 billion in foreign military financing, 200 million in economic support funds, and over 7 million for other security assistance programs, including international military education and training, international narcotics control and law enforcement, non-proliferation, anti-terrorism, demining, and related programs. The $650 million from the year 2014 for the foreign military financing would be the first step in this funding to move forward, pending congressional notification and approval. So we are building up, and we have been since the era of Sadat, building up that military in that region, which has fired upon protesters, which has put through a kangaroo court essentially that just wiped clean the slate of and the conscience of the former military dictators with the current dictators' rule. And we are going to wonder why the people there would be upset with us once they realize that we are partly financing this huge military apparatus that is used to control them. On that case, I would like to congratulate and thank and hope he keeps doing it, Senator Leahy from Vermont, who has on two separate occasions this year held up foreign aid going to Egypt. When they had brought up the $650 million, I believe, that was held up in Congress, it was because Senator Leahy, from this news article, was able to put an injunction in it and say, whoa, I'm going to filibuster this. If it goes through, we want to stop it. Which is good. It is right and just. It's going to stop these people from using the 10 Apache attack helicopters on their own folks. And that's just, it's crazy and scary to us that we are financing and supporting these people that are undemocratic in this day and age. They're undemocratic, and they're instilling anger and hatred in their own public because the official opposition doesn't exist. I forgot to bring up the other point in that article about in the Sisi administration, where they've outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood, which, while it has several nasty elements to it, did win an election, and they did try to work with a democracy and work with votes, as compared to General Sisi, who stepped in. He stepped in, put together a completely rigged election so that he could have some official element to himself. And with that, let's see. And that's still going on. There's another article just today. You should contact your congressperson and ask them to stop this aid because it's still being held up in Congress, but but the administration is trying to get it to go through. The administration wants it to go through so that they can keep funding them because they feel that it could actually stop terrorism. Unbeknownst that actions like this is what causes terrorism against us in the United States. By us funding these despots overseas and with their iron heel being pressed against the throats of half their people, no wonder they hate the people that do it to them, and then they connect the dots and they see it leads back to the United States. That's not safe for us. That's not safe for us, and that's not the way we should be going. So contact your congressperson and talk to them about it so that we should help out. Part of the appropriations is to give food aid to the Palestinians. This is part of that general bill. Feeding poor people, it's not so scary, but giving aid to Egypt's military, I don't see how that's going to benefit us when they have another coup, when they have another revolt, or when Egyptians start connecting the dots and trying to attack us. And with that, I want to bring up the American Spectator. Doug Banjo, his issue and his argument, just to show that this thought process of not aiding these authoritarians around the world, his argument is not a fringe argument. His argument is cancel aid to Egypt. The new Mubarak is just as bad as the old Mubarak. 3 years ago, Hosni Mubarak dictatorship ingloriously collapsed. The Obama administration was constantly following events, first embracing Mubarak, then calling for a negotiated transition, and finally endorsing his overthrow. The Egyptian people ignored Washington at every turn. The Muslim Brotherhood's electoral success upset the military's plans to retain power, but the deep state persisted, and Morsi, who was the elected president, but he had little control, not over the military, which was an empire unto itself, or the police. Nearly a year ago, General Sisi squashed any possibility of the government slipping outside of the military's control by staging a coup. Through all of this, the Obama administration took the least principled position possible. We're going to jump right to this conclusion. However, even the Senate doesn't go far. I'm going to jump down one paragraph. There is no good answer to Egypt. No one knows how a Morsi presidency would have turned out. But skepticism of the Brotherhood in power is understandable, given the abuses of similar parties elsewhere. We do know how a Sisi presidency is likely to turn out, a rerun of Mubarak's authoritarian and corrupt regime. That's not attractive either. Repressive rule isn't even likely to deliver stability, since the Egyptian people will eventually tire of yet another government which engages in jackbooted arrest, brutal torture, and arbitrary punishment, while failing to deliver economic growth. The best Washington can do now is to stay out. Subsidize no one. Endorse no one. Stop talking nonsense about democracy. Don't publicly offer the government advice it's sure to reject. Work privately to advance important interests. Leave Egyptians to settle their own fate. Things still might fall apart in Cairo, but for the first time in decades, America really wouldn't be at fault. I strongly endorse this position. I think it makes sense for our future. And I would love to hear what you guys think. I have an email address and I have a post office box address if you want to mail me something. It should be popping up. Yep. My P.O. Box is 108 Auburn, New Hampshire, 03032. Just address it to America First Committee or my name, S. Daniel Mattingly. And also you can email me directly at americafirstcommittee@gmail.com. I love to have your feedback. Let's try to have this be a more interactive show. I would love that, just so that we can actually connect to each other and try to network out and show the world that we're not there. We're there to respect them. We're not there to overlord them. And I want to thank you for watching. Have a great night. Email me, please.